So if you can't close clients, you're probably doing something wrong in your sales process. If you're struggling to acquire clients and predictably close people and get people to say yes to you, it's because you're doing something wrong. It's never the prospect, it's always you. Bit of a reality check. But today's video is a live training session with a sales rep of mine. I'm doing one-to-one training, explaining how to avoid making mistakes when it comes to answering questions from prospects on a sales call. So sales call, you've got your questions, you've got your pitch, and then obviously the prospect's going to ask you questions to understand how your product works for them. In today's video, I'm going to basically be showing you my process for answering questions. I've got a 4-step process, and I've got some advice for the end of the sales rep that is going to help him convert massively. I've trained, I don't know how many sales reps I've trained quite a lot of sales reps. I've done loads of sales calls myself. I've developed this beautiful 4-step process. I'm going to share it with you and you're going to love it. It's going to help you close more deals for your agency or your coaching business. My name's Charlie Morgan. I've built and scaled 2 companies, NorthFlow Consulting, an agency to 7 figures. We sold it. Imperium Agency, a coaching business to multi-7 figures. This YouTube channel is for me to document my journey to 8 figures and show you basically how I'm doing that and my thought process so I can look back at it and reminisce basically. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this video. If you do, please like, comment, subscribe, do all that fancy stuff. In fact, if you haven't already liked the video, like, come on, like, what are you doing, right? But either way, let's hop into this video and I'll walk you through how I answer questions for prospects so you can close more deals. So we want, someone's going to ask us the question, right?
Yeah.
And what we want to do is we want to first of all gratify the question, right? And that's where we're saying words like, great question, I'm so glad you've asked that. It's one of my favorite things to answer. The reason we do that is because when we gratify someone's question, it reinforces their curiosity about the product and their interest in it.
Yeah.
If they weren't interested, they wouldn't be asking questions. So the reason we want to ask questions is because, gratify questions is because we want them to ask more. Because the more questions they ask, the more conviction we can provide them with, the more information they have that's relevant to them to buy the product, right?
Yeah.
So gratify is step number 1. You know, just good question. And you actually want to sound like you mean it. Because a lot of salespeople are like, oh, that's a good question. Or great question.
Yeah.
You actually want to be like, John, I'm so glad you've asked that, right? Because every question is an opportunity for you to instill more conviction into the prospect, right? So gratification. Then after gratification is basically the answer, right? And this is the key part. So there's no like specific time as to how long the answer should be, but all you want to do is answer their question.
Yeah.
Right? So like you basically, someone will say like, okay, well, can you just walk me through? So in the Loom thing, I saw that you automate it. Like, how does that work exactly? Right? So what we're not going to do is we're not going to start to tell them about the copy of the Loom and answer anything they don't want answered specifically. So we have to keep sort of like, you want to imagine that like the person's, it's like bowling, right? When you go bowling, you know, if you're like me and you're bad at bowling, you put up those barriers, right? To hit the pins in the end, right? Yeah. What's happened is when the prospect asks a question, they're basically setting barriers for the conversation, right? And so what you want your answer to do is ideally take a straight line down here. But what might happen is you might tangent slightly, bounce off the barrier and come back. But it's important that you don't break through the barrier, because if you break through the barrier, then you're not going to hit the pins at all, if that makes sense. The more straight your question is, the more pins you will hit and the more effective the answer will be, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So just bear that in mind. It's just a little metaphor I always use to just, you know, keep myself on track. Once you've answered the question, right? And remember, once again, we want to show them, not tell them, right? Yeah. So it's like, one thing that I'm a bit nervous about is the sales part of it. I'm like, it would be really helpful to see sales calls, like maybe listen to something that someone's done. Do you guys have something like that? Great question. I'm so glad you've asked that. And absolutely we do. Here is where you can listen to like 25 example calls that Charlie's done specifically to the objection handling stage.
Yeah.
Just showing them, right?
Yeah.
Now, the third part, which is really important, is what would I even phrase this as? It's like, it's reinforced conviction, right? So what this means is you want to use your answer, right, to introduce more conviction into the prospect. So after you finish the answer, you want to link it back to their goal. So yeah, so having those sales call recordings, it's going to make it so much easier for you to get to that 10 grand a month. And that's also why I have so much bloody confidence this is going to work for you.
Yeah, I remember Jack done this
Yeah.
yesterday actually, where he kept referring back to the 5 appointments a day, and
Yeah,
he's
exactly.
yeah,
So like every time they ask a question, you want the answer to be another vehicle for them to have confidence that they can get what they want,
yeah,
if that makes sense. So, if someone wants to get 10K a month and they ask you a question like, oh, what's like do you have a process for like hiring VAs? Because I've only ever had bad VAs. Right. Great question. So glad you've asked that. It's really important to make sure you get the right VA, right? Simple answer is we have amazing process for it. So I can actually show you this, right? Well, first of all, we can actually give you one, but if you want to hire one yourself, here's the SOP. It's a 13-step process. I won't bore you with the details. It's really important, by the way, we don't go into the details unless they want us to. So the
oh,
answer should be as high level as you can get away with, right?
yeah,
And then if they have a question, like if they have a meta question, which is a question within a question, like, oh, like how does the legal agreement work for the VAs? Or like, how much do you pay your VAs, right? Usually if someone asks something like that, I'd say, oh, that's all covered in the program. You won't have to worry about something like that at all. It's, it's within that range of $3 to $5. You want to still keep it vague, if that makes sense.
yeah,
Otherwise you just start coaching them. So the reinforced conviction thing, like how do you hire VAs? Well, here's how it works. And this SOP, it's so powerful. It's going to give you the right VA. It's just another reason that's, basically going to help you get to 10 grand a month. You can have the right VA in place to get to that point that would, facilitate you quitting your job or having that financial freedom you want.
yeah.
You see the point? So that's kind of like, and then step number 4 is to shut up, right?
Yeah.
It's one of the most important stages
Yeah.
because like this sort of like bang, 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 bang. After you answer the question, you can round it off with something like, I hope that answers your question, or so that's that, right? But I usually just finish the reinforced convictions. So like, great question. Here's the answer. Here's me showing you the answer, keeping it high level. And that right there, what I've just shown you, is yet another reason as to why you're going to make 10 grand a month with us without any problem at all. So that's that. Also, that's the VA thing. And you wrap it up. And if you do this in the right way and you give the prospect enough information, then they'll move on to the next question, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
What you want to imagine is when you finish your pitch, right? What the prospect's going to do is imagine like you've built a puzzle before, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? I might
Yes.
have explained. Did I explain this to you yesterday?
I don't
Puzzle?
think you did.
No.
I'm
Okay.
not, I'm not sure.
So it might have been the previous one. So what you've got to imagine is like a puzzle here, right? Just imagine this is like an actual puzzle, right? I'll just find like a puzzle, right? Like a jigsaw puzzle, right? So every time the prospect asks a question, right, they're putting a puzzle piece into their puzzle. And this puzzle could consist of 10 pieces. It could consist of 3 pieces. Once they've basically completed their puzzle, then they understand it well enough to ask the price question.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So what we're trying to do here is basically, maybe this question here is like, how do you hire your VAs? Like they might, because from the pitch, they might already have like, 90% of this filled out, but there might be like 3 things they need to know to really understand it, to feel like they can actually buy it, if that makes sense. So like, how do you hire your VAs? How does the Loom automation thing work? And do you have example calls I can listen to? And everything else you've covered in the pitch because you've tailored it to them. And once you've put these in place, they've now got a complete puzzle. And once they've got a complete puzzle, they'll ask you about the price. Now, this is why it's really important that we answer the questions properly, because if you give them a vague answer, they'll feel uncomfortable asking the question again. And then they'll ask the price without fully understanding the product. And that's why they won't buy. Or that's why objections will manifest as well. Right?
Yeah.
So that's that. And then you just shut up, and then they'll just continue asking questions, and then they'll ask about the price. And then depending on how good your pitch was, how emotional they are, they might have some objections as well. An interesting thing about objections, and this is really important to know, is that they vary in strength, right? So objections don't exist in like, what would we call it? They don't exist like in a silo, right? It's not like I want to think about it or I don't want to think about it. It's how much do I want to think about it, right?
Yeah.
So if you've been through the mindset module, you'll have watched the non-binary thinking thing, right? And like a lot of people think like with objections, it's either like I want to talk to my wife or I don't want to talk to my wife. It's not like a binary thing. It's how much do I want, how much confidence do I have to not have to do that, right?
Yeah.
And the more conviction you have, the weaker the objection will be. The more
Yeah.
doubt the prospect has, the stronger the objection will be.
I actually saw you do this with one of your calls where they said they had to speak with their sister, and then you just you just said, "You sure, this is a great product. I'm sure your sister would love it," and they ended up buying
Yeah,
without.
exactly. So what you can see there is that was an easy objection to crack
Yeah.
because he had lots of conviction, but just a little bit of doubt, right?
Mm,
And so like if he didn't have like that would have been his objection regardless of how the call went.
yeah.
But if I hadn't done the call well enough up until the point of him objecting, that objection would have been harder to, it would have taken twice or three times as long, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's why like people focus way too much on rebuttals when in reality, the first 30 minutes of the call is what will make the objection easy to overcome.
Got you.
Kind of
Yeah.
like you're just softening them up, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's just a quick thing on objections. Like they will vary in strength. Almost every prospect you sign will have them, but whether or not they're easy to overcome depends on how well you do the question stage, how well you do your questioning stage, right? And how well you do the pitching stage. But what we'll do is like, when you start doing calls, we'll start reviewing your pitch and your objections, if that makes sense. I'll probably do some reviews outside of the tri-weekly calls because there's just not enough time on those calls. And then you'll slowly but surely, probably quite quickly actually, you'll just build your own unique way of selling. But because you've got a sick product, 300 testimonials and a guarantee, it's usually quite easy to sell, if that makes sense.